Hey again, you guys. Welcome back to my Flickers of Fear show. As I mentioned on the last one, this is going to be my new series where I'm just going to be talking about old and new horror movies that I watched in any particular week. Ones that I didn't really think Tom would care about seeing, but ones that I had been wanting to see, or, ones that have been recommended and that I had put on my list. So let's get on with it. So as if the first movie in this series wasn't depressing and shocking enough, I decided to just go whole hog on this one. Another movie that I've been wanting to see for a very long time, weirdly. This is how this kind of came about. So the other day when I decided to watch this movie, because this movie, it's Threads, by the way, from 1984. It had been on Shudder for quite a while. I had heard about it. I didn't see it back when it came out, but I knew it by reputation. So, the other day I was kind of like, I was having kind of a crappy day, and I was kind of like, you know what might make me feel better? Watching a movie that's really, really grim and depressing, that's about a nuclear holocaust where everybody dies. That's what I think would make me feel better. So I sat down on Shudder and watched Threads. Now, I'm sure my British viewers will know about Threads. It seems like everybody knows about that. It's like an infamous film. Maybe American ones not so familiar. However, if you are a child of the 70s or the 80s in the United States, you will probably be familiar with a little 1983 TV movie called The Day After, which depicted a nuclear war and its aftermath. Which in the 80s, a pretty likely scenario. It's actually probably still a pretty likely scenario. We just don't think about it as much, I guess. But back in the 80s, it was very, very much in the front of the public consciousness. There was a lot of like Armageddon type stuff that came out, all of which was rather horrifying. So I will say that I did see The Day After. I believe it was on ABC, I want to say. I remember some things about it, and I remember it being pretty gruesome and pretty upsetting and scary. I think I remember more that, being in school the next day, because I think I was in 5th grade. I think I was about 11 when it came out, and everybody talking about it because everybody had watched it. And so I remember my 5th grade teacher, kind of fielding questions about it, and everybody being like really, really worried now about, nuclear war. It was the 80s, kids. If you guys grew up in the 80s and you kind of came to, at a formidable age, like in the early mid 1980s, threat of nuclear war was it seemed a very real possibility. And so a lot of the media at the time kind of reflected that. Now, as I said, I don't remember a great deal about The Day After. I remember it being like a decent movie, and it did have some horrific imagery in it that was, somewhat realistically based. But I think what the problem that The Day After maybe had was that it attempted to go a little bit too quote unquote Hollywood, in the sense that it had some actors in it that were actually kind of well known at the time. I mean, even though I was only 11, like I recognized a lot of the actors in it. Jo Beth Williams was in it. She had just been in Poltergeist the year before. Jason Robards was in it. Steve Guttenberg was in it, for Christ's sake. So it wasn't like you were seeing Mr. and Mrs. Joe Nobody, getting blown away in a nuclear holocaust. It's like you were seeing famous people who you knew were probably going to die, but it was fake. You know what I mean? So I do feel like having recognizable actors in it sort of worked against it in a way. I also feel like, and like I said, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't seen it in a very long time, but I do think that as grim as The Day After was, and as horrifying as it was, and it was, I'm not saying that it wasn't, it did have at least a little bit of, the Americans, we're all going to pull together, and, we're going to farm now, and we have gumption, and, everything, it's like everything sucks, but it'll be okay. There was like a little bit of hope. Whereas Threads, which was also made for television, but in the UK, gave its viewers no such comfort. So I feel like it's basically that old cliche of The Day After being like, yeah, we're going to make this really grim, realistic movie about a nuclear apocalypse. And then Threads in the UK said, kindly hold my lager. So Threads was made in 1984. And as I said, a lot of people have said it's kind of like the British answer to The Day After, because it came about a year and a few months after. But the thing about it was that It was actually made not so much in response to The Day After, but it was made because the BBC, they had actually commissioned this film way the fuck back in 1965, which was called The War Game. And it was very much like Threads is now. It was a docudrama in the sense that it had some documentary type aspects to it, but it was essentially like a reenactment as realistic as possible of what a nuclear war and its aftermath would look like. Now, The War Game was, as I said, was made by the BBC or commissioned by the BBC. But then when it was kind of shown to, you know, the board or whoever, they were kind of like, yeah, we can't show that, which I don't know. That's very funny to me. It's like, make a really realistic movie about the aftermath of a nuclear war. And then you show it to them. You're like, we can't show that. Well, they said they couldn't show it because they were afraid that everyone would commit suicide after. Well, not everyone, but that a lot of people would commit suicides after it. It's like, well, we can't be responsible for that. But so they didn't show it. I don't think they actually showed it on British TV until, you know, probably decades later. But whoever was running the BBC in the 80s had actually saw The War Game and knew that it hadn't ever aired and was like, man, we need to do another thing like that. Nowadays, we'll do it contemporary. So let's make one like that. So we'll show it on BBC. Now, the writer of this movie is Barry Hines. Now, if you know anything about British cinema, you'll know that Barry Hines, he wrote many other things too, but he also probably best known for writing the novel A Kestrel for a Knave, which was the basis of the classic Ken Loach film Kes. I've both read the book and seen the movie. They're both amazing classics of British literature, classic of British cinema. And if you haven't seen them and if you really like British cinema, then you probably should. You know, Kes and the novel that it was based on, very, very grim. You know, Barry Hines kind of very well known as being like a champion of the working class, showing their struggles. So he was actually a very good writer to get, you know, to get involved in this project, you know, the making of Threads. Now, the director of it was Mick Jackson. He had done some TV and things like that prior. Interestingly, after Threads, he made some more movies. And the two that I found the most interesting, he actually made a couple of kind of big budget, like Hollywood type movies. He was the director of LA Story with Steve Martin, if you guys remember that one. That was from 87, I want to say. And he also was the director of The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. So if you've seen those movies, Threads is nothing like that. So don't go into this expecting to be some fucking walk in the park, because it's not. I'm going to tell you right now, Threads, a lot of people, particularly in the UK that saw it when they were kids or teenagers, said this was the most horrifying, and still is the most horrifying film they've ever seen, just because it was something that could really happen. It was completely realistic, and it just made them depressed and horrified, and they just have never seen anything like, you know, and images from it are like burned into their retinas. And I can totally, totally see that, because this movie, you really, really have to be in the right mindset to want to watch this movie, because it is not fun. There is no happiness. There is no joy. There is no hope. There is no nothing. This movie starts out grim and just gets fucking grimmer and grimmer. It's just a nonstop descent into complete and utter despair. And I mean, it is, you will probably feel like ill after watching it, or at least will be like, man, just kill me. This is terrible. But I will say, in its defense, I will say that if you're in a real, real bad mood, maybe, this is at least how I reacted. Because like I said, I'd had kind of a crappy day when I decided to watch this, because I'm like perverse like that. But so when I decided to watch this, and after it was over, I was kind of like, wow, that was probably one of the most depressing things I've ever seen. But I kind of feel better because, you know, I got problems, but I don't have any problems like those people have fucking problems not being shit. All right. So as I said, Threads, don't go into it expecting it to be like a horror movie or even like a regular narrative movie. It does have characters and it does have, you know, situations and things that are happening, but it's not really structured like a standard movie. It's more like, as I said, it's generally called a docudrama. So it would essentially be like something you might see, you know, back in the good old days when, you know, the Discovery Channel and History Channel actually showed real shit instead of just being all Bigfoot shows. and ghost hunting. So it has like some documentary style, aspects to it. This many megatons fell on the thing, and this is what would happen 10 years later. So it has that kind of stuff, giving you statistics, but then the rest of it is kind of like a reenactment showing exactly what would happen to a regular city in the UK if this ever were to come to pass. So this is set in Sheffield, an industrial city, and it kind of revolves around a couple of families. I don't really want to say that there's main characters. Like I said, characters are not really the point of this. The point of this docudrama, the point of this film, was to show people and to get them to emotionally react to, this is what a nuclear war would be like. Can we please all do something to never ever have this happen? Because it's pretty much the most horrifying thing you can imagine. So it's, in that sense, I don't really like to use the word polemic because it sounds very judgy, but it does have an agenda, and it is very, very successful in getting that across, that watching this, you'd be like, yeah, we should never do that, because that would be the fucking worst thing ever. So this follows essentially two families. Kind of the main characters, if you want to call them that, are sort of like a young couple. They're in their, the teens or their early 20s, Jimmy and Ruth. And at the very beginning of the movie, you see them in the car, and they're kind of talking about, shit that people like that in a kind of a working class town talk about. And it comes to pass that Ruth is pregnant. So over the course, like, Jimmy kind of decides to, even though he's very young, decides to kind of step up and do the right thing. Oh, we'll get married, both of our families are going to help out, and we'll get a flat and we'll raise the baby. It'll be awesome. Now, I think that one of the most effective things about this movie, and one of the most heartbreaking things about this movie, even though you don't really get to know any of the characters other than just regular ass people, which in a way makes them more relatable in a sense, because it's just kind of like people, like acquaintances that, you don't know a great deal about them. You as the viewer know that about halfway through this movie, the fucking nuclear bomb's going to fall and everything's going to go to shit. And so all of the stuff that, all of the worries that these characters have in the first half of the movie are not going to mean anything. Everything that they're talking about is completely meaningless. And I think that that drives the point home really, really well, because they don't harp on it. They don't, but it's just, I think the realism in the first half, where you're just interacting with the characters, you're just kind of hanging out with them. Another thing I like about it too is that they're not really talking about the escalating tensions. It's just kind of like very, very much in the background. You see, somebody reading a newspaper or somebody watching a news broadcast or something like that about escalating tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has moved nukes into Iran, like against a treaty, and U.S. is threatening nuclear strikes unless they take them out by a certain time period. The time period passes. Now all this kind of stuff is going on. So it just keeps like ramping up and up. But the thing about it is that, as what would happen in real life, which, like I said, which is what makes this so scary, is that all the characters, they're not oblivious. They see that it's going on. Like I said, they see it on the news. They read it. They even have like Jimmy and his friend like in the pub kind of talking about it at one point, like, oh, this looks bad, But it seems like it's far away. It's such a big problem. And they're just kind of like, well, you can't really do anything about it except kind of go about your life and hope for the best. And that's exactly what these people are doing. And I think that that's what makes this, again, so frightening and so relatable, is that that's exactly what most people are doing, because the threat of a nuclear war, and I know I lived through the shit in the 80s when you had drills where you had to like climb on your desk and all this other kind of stuff because the bombs were falling, as if that would save you. But it's just kind of, it's the enormity of it. You can't really wrap your head around it. So and there's nothing you personally, as a little insignificant person, can do to prevent it or stop it. So it's almost kind of like you can't worry about it. It's just too much for your brain to handle. It's like, if you worry about it, then you might as well just kill yourself, because there's nothing you can do. And I think that there's, at one point in the movie, as I said, Jimmy and his friend are in the pub, and, it's kind of on the news, like how the tensions are escalating and everybody kind of gets quiet in the pub, like, oh man, maybe this is going to be worse than we thought. But the thing is, nobody really thinks that the worst is actually going to happen. I mean, you as a viewer know that the worst is going to happen, obviously, because that's what you're watching this movie for. But, the characters don't know, but they still think something's bad, but you never think it's going to be as bad as it turns out. So the two characters are kind of having this discussion, and Jimmy's like, well, aren't you worried about her? Don't you care? And, his friend is like, yeah, I care, but, there's nothing I can do about it. And, if it does happen, I at least, want to be drunk or having a good time or, use the most of my time to like have fun, because what else can you do except just keep on trucking and, just hope it doesn't happen. So that's kind of what all the characters are doing. So they're making all these plans. They, there's these little scenes where, where Jimmy and Ruth are in their new flat and they're scraping off the ugly old wallpaper, because she's pregnant and they're going to, set up their nursery and everything. And that it's just all for nothing. And it's just really, really sad. So then about, as I said, probably about the midpoint of the movie, this is about a 2-hour film, a little under 2 hours, I believe it is. Midpoint of the movie, you get the mushroom cloud that you've all been waiting for, which that's kind of a fucked up way of saying it. But yeah, essentially. After that, it's just, oh my God, this movie is just unrelentingly bleak. Just the worst fucking shit. And the thing about it is that this movie, they did a year of research. They consulted government officials. They consulted scientists. They consulted everybody that knew anything about nuclear war, about its long-term effects, about its short-term effects, about what would happen, everything. They did a lot of homework on this one. So they wanted this to be as realistic as possible. They didn't want anything exaggerated. They obviously wanted to make a point, but they didn't want to have to blow anything out of proportion, forgive my use of words, to make that point. Now, interestingly, I think, though, that as grim and fucking bleak as this movie is, they might have undersold it just a little bit. You know what I mean? Just in the sense that this is horrific, but if it happened in real life, it would be even more horrific. So that's a cheerful thought. If you watch this, just keep that in mind. But yeah, so they did a lot of homework to get this as realistic as possible. So basically what happens, the mushroom cloud, one of the nukes like explodes. I can't remember, like up in the atmosphere. It's, what was it? 30,000 megatons. I can't remember what it is now. It says like there's text crawl on there, like saying what's going on, how many people were killed in the initial bombing, how many people were killed by the subsequent dust that went up. And things of that nature. So yeah, so the whole fucking neighborhood blown to shit, like all the windows are blown out. Obviously like a shit ton of people die in the initial blast. And one thing that's great about this movie, if that's kind of a weird way of putting it, I just realized, but one thing that's effective about this movie, let's put it that way, is that I think this was at the time the only movie to show the long-term effects of what a nuclear war would bring. Like, a nuclear winter where all the dust would go up into the atmosphere and would essentially block out the sun, meaning that the earth would cool down to a point where, you couldn't really grow crops as effectively anymore. The growing season would be much shorter. All the radiation would kind of poison the soil down to a certain degree. So, they were talking about it, it's not just the bombing, it's not just the immediate effects, but it's also, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line, obviously, there's going to be mass starvation, mass disease, so it's not going to be a fun time for anyone involved over the whole planet. It's going to affect you whether the bombs hit you or not. So I like that it kind of went into that. Another thing that is very, very effective about this movie, I feel like, too, is that, as I said, this isn't really focused on characters. It's focused on the situation. It's focused on showing you, exactly what would happen while giving you enough of relatable, just regular ass people going about their regular ass mundane lives that you could see yourself in them. You didn't have to get to know them. You didn't have to, it was sad when they died, but you were just kind of like, oh, that guy, I love that guy. It wasn't like that, but it was just enough that you could make yourself a stand-in, I guess, for the characters. So I think they hit that balance like really, really well. So one thing that they do in this, which I think is super effective, is that some of the characters, like after all the shit starts to hit the fan, some of the characters disappear and you never like hear from them again. Like, so Ruth, the bombs like fall, their houses fall and everything like that. Her parents, I think her grandmother ends up dying, and then her parents eventually end up dying, not, I don't think from the initial bombing, but from, radiation sickness and various things that happen in the subsequent days. And obviously people start starvation, the water's poisoned and all these other things. So she actually ends up surviving. And because she's pregnant, she decides that she's going to leave the house against the advice of whatever authorities are remaining, and she's going to go try to find Jimmy. Well, spoiler alert, she never does find Jimmy, and nobody nobody ever finds Jimmy. You don't find out if he's dead, if he's still alive somewhere. And I kind of like that because that's exactly what it would be like. And I think the whole point of this movie, and the reason that it's called Threads, which they kind of say at the beginning, because they're talking about, humanity being sort of like a tapestry or like a spider web of all these interconnecting threads of, people making things for other people. And, we all like need each other to kind of, have a society. And that when some of those threads are broken, it, makes a much larger impact than you might think. So I think that it's good that it showed just these hanging threads where you never find out what happened, because that's exactly what would happen if this happened in real life. You don't find out where Jimmy was. The last thing you see is he hid under a truck during the initial blast with his friend. And then, after kind of the worst of it passes, he runs out of the truck and he's got, I got to find Ruth. And then he takes off and you never fucking see him again. And I kind of like that they did that. Another thing they do too is that they also have, aside from, kind of following the families a little bit, is they also have these sort of, I guess, like civic authority type people. And I guess they have like their day-to-day jobs are kind of like other type of jobs, but they've also taken these courses to, readiness courses for, in case of nuclear war, you're going to be activated like to do this and that and the other. So they have their little binders full of like all the instructions, who they're supposed to call and what they're supposed to do. You're supposed to check on, all the farming stuff, make sure that the stores are getting all the food so people don't starve. And you got to make sure the clean water. So, you got to make sure the roads are, this road remains clear and all this other stuff. So it's those people, and a bunch of them get activated. But these people, they're not dumb, obviously, and they are trained. But as I said earlier, no one, people prepared for this. I mean, they had contingency plans. I mean, they had, like I said, they had a whole binding of shit they were supposed to do in these situations, but I don't think they were prepared for the enormity of it, how bad it was, because they're just human. You can't really, unless you're in that scenario, and a scenario like that is just so outside the bounds of what most people have ever been through, that you can't imagine it. You can't imagine how bad it could be. So, the lack of preparedness is kind of an issue too. So they have a thing where there's a bunch of them, they get activated, they take them down to this kind of underground bunker that they'd prepared, but it wasn't even ready. There was just like bunk beds and like some fucking chemical toilets and shit like that they had to throw in there at the last minute. And the dudes are down there and they're obviously trying to do the best they can, with their binders, and we have all these numbers and this is the person you call for this, and we got to check on this. But it's like everything's turning to shit. Everything is just turning into chaos. People were looting the stores. They don't have any place to put bodies. They don't have any place to put, people that are breaking the law, looters. In the end, they just end up having to shoot them because they don't know what else to do. So it's just kind of like this escalating thing of chaos where no one really knows. Everybody kind of wants to do something to help, but it's just the problem is too big for them. And you can really see, them just getting more and more frustrated, and they're kind of like starting to fight each other, and they can't get anybody else on the radio. And then they're kind of like, the bunker where they are, like they're underneath the city hall, and like the city hall has been bombed and like it's falling and they can't, get out. And, the air is starting to get poisoned. They're running out of oxygen. So they're kind of flipping out and everything. And so they kind of follow them a little bit too. And I also like, much in the way that they did with the Jimmy character, who just kind of like, ran off and then you never see him again, was that they kind of show like all these people down here in this bunker kind of like arguing, like, what are we going to do? And it's like, people are going to die anyway. Maybe we should, we can't even get out of here ourselves. And, when are they going to dig us out? And so they kind of show them doing that. And then they kind of cut away to some other shit. And then later they just have somebody kind of coming across this bunker, and then they're just all dead in there. So they didn't show them dying. They just showed like later on, yep, they all died. You know what I mean? But like I said, that's kind of, as I said, what makes this movie so scary and so effective is that it's completely realistic to what exactly would happen. I mean, and it's terrifying. It's really, really a terrifying movie. It's not, so there's nothing, horror movie about it. There's nothing, in the sense that it's not, it's not fictional, obviously. It seems very real. And the fact that the actors that are in it, most of them are actors, but I think the girl that played Ruth, I think her name is Karen Meager, if I'm pronouncing that right. She had actually been in a couple of like minor sort of TV roles like prior to this, but wasn't like she was super recognizable or anything. And she went on to have a TV career after this, but a lot of the people that are in this were just kind of people that turned up like at a, at a audition, where very famously they told all these people to come to this place, and they were just like, just show up and look really miserable and like wear rags and stuff to be extras. And then they put them in the movie. So I think the fact that there is nobody recognizable in this is like makes it way scarier, because these could just be regular fucking people. It's not like, oh my God, Steve Gutenberg died in the fucking apocalypse. That's terrible. It's just like, oh my God, that's a person that's just like my next door neighbor. That could be me. You know what I mean? So I feel like that was something that made it a lot more effective. One thing too, and it's interesting, and I think they were actually really, really wise to do this, is that while they do show the larger effects, one, I like that they kept it to one city, Sheffield, so they could show just the impact. It was, it was kind of like a microcosm of what would be happening in other cities around the world. But you only needed this one, you only had a few characters to focus on. So you could kind of keep it close to home while still showing, the larger effects of what would be going on. So it could make it more relatable to the viewer, because, obviously if you're just going to show a mushroom cloud way over there, that's not really going to affect people as much as showing, the effects of, the shit, like the shop, like next door, like the glass blowing out and everyone being burned alive, and shit. So I think they struck a good balance there. But it was great because there were all these just little moments that really brought home to you how horrific this would be. And it was just like a little silly shit. It was just like an old dude reading a newspaper, like on the can, like when the bombs fell. Because I said, oh, that's probably what would happen to me with my fucking luck. But I mean, it's funny, that was pretty much like the only moment of any kind of humor in this film, was like the dude like, oh shit, you know what I mean? just because like a lot of it was so relatable, because I was like, holy shit, that's probably what happened. Like nuclear bombs fall and I'd be sitting on the fucking toilet. But there's stuff like that. There was like a close up of like a woman's leg, like she's peeing down her leg because she's so terrified, like when the bomb hits. There's stuff like, there's one scene where like a lot of people have said like really stuck with them, with just this woman, and she was just holding this burned baby like in her arms, and she was just staring at Ruth like with this fucking 1,000-yard stare, and it was like really creepy. There's like burned corpses. There's like this old guy like laying out some burned Star Wars figurines. There's one really upsetting one, because you guys know what a cat lover I am. There's one like really upsetting scene with like a cat. There's like fire in the foreground, and then the cat's like rolling around as if in agony. Hopefully they didn't do anything really bad to that cat. It was 1984, so you weren't really allowed to do that. So hopefully it was all monitored by, the proper authorities. But it really did look like that cat was like burning alive. And I was just kind of like, oh shit, like that really, really bummed me out. So, but it was just like really little moments like that, and then there's the whole sequence where Ruth goes to this clinic or this hospital or something like that, like looking for Jimmy. And you can tell that it's just like complete chaos. It's like everyone's screaming. It's like there's just tons of people outside, because obviously everybody's hurt, whether they got hurt in the bombs, they had radiation sickness or whatever. And obviously the doctors and nurses are completely overwhelmed. They don't have any medicines. They don't have any bandages. They don't have anything. It's just people are on the floor getting limbs cut off, like with just a rag in their mouth. And it's just kind of like the fucking worst thing ever. And so there's a lot of really affecting imagery like that, and affecting scenes like that. Even if you don't have a deep connection with the characters, the fact that they're just human characters who are just like you and me, I think really sells it. I mean, for me, it did anyway. I mean, I found the movie really, really affecting and really, really upsetting, depressing, just really, really grim. Also, another thing too, that I don't think The Day After did, was that Threads actually jumps ahead in time several times. After the bombing and, the initial aftermath where everything was blown to shit and everybody was dying of radiation poisoning and whatnot, then it jumps ahead a few months, jumps ahead a few more months. Ruth has her baby kind of, all alone in a barn somewhere. The baby seems to be okay, like physically, like it looks okay. Then they kind of jump ahead 10 years. Where the daughter is, who they call Jane, although they don't call her that in the movie, but I think that's what she's credited as. But you can see that the children that were born since the cataclysm are obviously severely mentally challenged. They can't really, they talk, but they only talk in like just one-word sentences. Everybody just has to work in the fields because, as I said, because of the nuclear winter, and subsequent climate change, drastic climate change. There is not, the growing season is very, very short. And if you don't just spend every waking moment farming, then, everyone's just going to starve to death, at some point. And there's also so many corpses, they didn't have anywhere to put them. And it's just so disease was rampant. And, at some point between 10 and 13 years after the cataclysm, like they're saying the UK would be down to its medieval levels of population. Most of the upcoming population would just be intellectually stunted because of all the, birth defects and whatnot. So it really kind of does go into the long-term effects, which I thought was really, really good and like really instructive. And as I said, at the 10-year mark, when Ruth actually collapses and dies because of all, obviously she's got cancer, she has cataracts and stuff like that because of the radiation sickness and because of, all of the poisoning, her daughter just kind of keeps poking at her like, work, like you have to get back up and get back out in the fields. And then when she dies, the kid just kind of looks at her like impassively, you know what I mean? Because she doesn't care, or because she's so used to people dying that it doesn't affect her, or because she doesn't understand the enormity of it. And she doesn't call her mom. She just calls her Ruth. She's like, Ruth, you know what I mean? So it's really little things like that that really kind of stick with you even more than, stock footage of the mushroom clouds and the explosions and all the buildings down and everything. And as I said, they do use some stock footage in this. They do use some stock photos of, actual people that had radiation poisoning and things like that. Interestingly, this is interesting too. The part where they, bombed Sheffield, the destruction you see of all the buildings and everything was absolutely real. Evidently, the producers, the BBC film crew or whatever, they went to this one neighborhood that the council was planning on demolishing anyway. So they told the film crew, knock yourself out, blow it up, knock it down, destroy it, do whatever you want. Because they, no one lived there, obviously. It was abandoned, and they were going to tear it down anyway. So they're just like, film what you want. So all the stuff you see with all the fucking busted up buildings, everything like that, all completely real. And all the fires, all completely real. They did all that stuff. It's just kind of one of those happy accidents, I guess, where they actually got to film the realistic looking shit. I will say that the special effects in this, it's weird because I was reading on the Wikipedia page and it was saying how like the radiation sickness makeup was just kind of like, oh, ketchup and Rice Krispies and stuff. But to me, it's like in the movie, it didn't really look like that. And I will say that the aforementioned, cat rolling around in agony thing, that looked pretty real. And also a lot of the burned corpses they showed, like in the rubble and stuff, also looked really real. If that was special effects, it was pretty damn good special effects for 1984. Just saying, like some of the stuff looked pretty fucking grisly. So, good job there. It's hard to tell that this was made for only 400,000 pounds. That's all I'm going to say. And so also if it jumping ahead 10 years and Ruth dying and, everybody starving to death and everything, is that wasn't bad enough, then it jumps ahead to 13 years later when Jane, Ruth's daughter, is now a few years older, obviously, and she is raped, so by these two guys who are trying to steal her food, and she gets pregnant, and the movie ends on the happy, happy scene of her screaming and giving birth to a baby, which they then hand her, and she looks at and just screams, and then it's like freeze frame. They don't show you what the baby looks like, but you're presuming, I mean, it's dead, but you're presuming that it's like mutated or whatever. So that's like the happy note that this movie ends on. So like I said, you really, really, I think everybody should see this movie just so we don't ever like push the big red button ever. Like everybody should see this. But I can understand if you don't really want to watch it because it is not a fun time. This is not a fucking, hey, let's pop some popcorn and watch Threads. Yeah, this is one of those movies where it's a very, very grim, bleak, fucking depressing ride. But honestly, I thought it was really, really well done. I mean, they did exactly what they set out to do. It is super effective. It's super terrifying. It's super scary. I did not find it cheesy in the least. I feel like if I watched the day after nowadays, maybe I shouldn't say this because I haven't seen it in so long, but I feel like if I watched that nowadays, it might come off as a little cheesy. This one really did not come off as cheesy by any stretch of the imagination. But I will say if perhaps you wanted to do a whole world-ending nuclear Armageddon party. You could watch Threads, you could watch The Day After. Some people have said there's another one called Testament, which is also very good. I think there's one called When the Wind Blows. I believe that one's animated, that's kind of along the same lines. There have been several. And as I mentioned before, The War Game from 1965, that was a BBC production, which, as I said, I think they subsequently did air on BBC. They wouldn't show it back in the 60s, but they did show it in the early 2000s, if I'm remembering it correctly. But yeah, if you're ever in the mood for some good old, let's watch the entire world burn, if it's one of those kind of days, or you're kind of having a bad day and you're just like, I want to see some people have really like the worst day imaginable, and maybe that will make me feel better, you could certainly do worse than Threads. And as I said, it's available on Blu-ray in the US and in the UK. And at the moment, at least as of this recording, it's also available on Shudder, at least in the US. So I would recommend checking it out if you like this genre of film and it sounds like something you would be into. It is, as I said, I said that it wasn't a horror film in the traditional sense. It's a horror film in the sense that it's horrifying. You know what I mean? Even just because it's so fucking realistic. And it's probably one of the most upsetting things I've ever seen. And I knew what was coming. Like, I knew what I was getting into because I had read various, pieces about it. So I kind of knew what I was getting into. But yeah, I mean, gotta say, I don't think anybody does despair like the British, although I don't know, some other countries might have some truck with that, but we'll see. It just seems like they're really, really good at not sanitizing anything or not making everything so, everything's going to be okay. Because I feel like we do that sometimes in the US, even like in the worst kind of situations. Because even like most famously, even like British horror movies that had like really depressing endings, like The Descent, and they had to change it, in the US version, so it wasn't quite so depressing, which that's always struck me as like very, very funny. Like, Americans have this kind of like, oh, things are shitty, it'll turn out okay. But the British are just kind of like, no, it's just going to get worse and worse. And it's just going to get even worse than that. Don't even think that we've gotten the worst that it could be, because it can always get worse. That seems like their whole mantra. So check it out, Threads from 1984. And I will see you on the next one. Bye.